The grand lobby of the Westmore Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers as the annual Children's Hospital benefit was in full swing. Men in dark suits and women in elegant dresses moved through the space, champagne glasses in hand, their laughter mixing with the gentle clink of glassware. In the corner stood a magnificent black grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the warm lights above. Through the revolving doors came Harold Matthews, a man whose 75 years showed in the lines of his face and the careful way he moved. His gray hair was neatly combed, and though his navy blue blazer had seen better days, it was clean and pressed for the occasion. Harold clutched a small envelope, his donation, in hands that bore the slight tremor of age, but remained strong and nimble, with long fingers that had spent a lifetime dancing across piano keys. Harold hadn't planned to attend such a fancy gathering. His neighbor Beth worked in the kitchen here and had mentioned the benefit. "They're raising money for the children's cancer ward," she'd told him over their fence that morning. "Anyone can come and make a donation." Those words had stirred something in Harold. Memories of his late wife, Jean, a kindergarten teacher who had loved children, and their own son, Thomas, who they had lost to leukemia at just 8 years old back in 1978. So here he was, feeling somewhat out of place among people who probably donated thousands while he had scraped together just $50 from his modest pension. Harold made his way to the donation table, where a young woman with kind eyes thanked him warmly for his contribution. He nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. As he turned to leave, figuring he'd done his part, his eyes caught sight of the piano again. Harold felt a familiar pull, like an old friend calling to him. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd played any piano other than the worn upright in his living room, the one Jean had bought him for their 30th anniversary, nearly 20 years ago now. Without really deciding to, Harold found himself drifting toward the instrument. The guests around him continued their conversations, barely noticing the elderly man who moved slowly but purposefully across the room. As he got closer, he could see it was a Steinway, probably worth more than his entire house. He stopped a respectful distance away, just admiring it at first. Then, glancing around and seeing no one paying him any mind, Harold stepped closer. The piano wasn't roped off. There was no sign saying not to touch it. In fact, it almost seemed to be waiting for someone, with its lid raised and bench pulled out slightly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" came a voice beside him. Harold turned to find a hotel employee, a middle-aged man with a name tag that read Robert. "One of the finest instruments I've ever seen," Harold replied, his voice soft with admiration. Robert smiled. "Do you play?" Harold nodded, a humble smile touching his lips. "I've played most of my life, yes." "Well, we don't have a pianist scheduled for another hour. If you'd like to play a little something, I don't see the harm," Robert said with a wink before being called away by another staff member. Harold stood there, heart suddenly beating faster. His fingers tingled with anticipation, the way they always did before touching keys. It had been so long since he'd played for anyone other than himself. Jean used to be his audience, sitting in their living room with her knitting while he played in the evenings. Since she'd passed 5 years ago, music had become a private comfort. Taking a deep breath, Harold carefully lowered himself onto the bench. It felt right, the height perfect, as if adjusted just for him. He placed his hands gently on the keys without pressing down, just feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. In his small apartment, Harold played from memory, pieces he'd known for decades. But here, on this magnificent instrument, what should he play? Something gentle to start, he thought. Something that wouldn't disturb the conversations around him, but might add to the pleasant atmosphere. He began with Debussy's Clair de Lune, his fingers finding the familiar pattern. The first notes rang out, clearer and richer than he'd expected, the Steinway's superior craftsmanship immediately apparent. Harold smiled to himself as he continued, the music flowing from some deep place within him that remained untouched by age. A few people nearby paused their conversations, turning slightly toward the unexpected music. Harold didn't notice, lost in the piece as his hands moved with the muscle memory of countless hours of practice and performance from years long past. As a young man, Harold had studied at a respected music conservatory, dreaming of concert halls and recording contracts. He'd had talent, his professors had told him so, but life had led him down a different path. Meeting Jean, falling in love, taking a steady job teaching music at a public high school to support their family. He never regretted his choices, finding joy in introducing generations of students to the beauty of music. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he wondered what might have been. The Debussy piece came to its gentle conclusion, and Harold heard a smattering of applause from those closest to the piano. He looked up, slightly startled to find several people had gathered around, watching him with appreciation in their eyes. An elderly woman nodded approvingly. A young couple smiled. A little girl in a party dress stared at him with wide-eyed wonder. Encouraged, Harold shifted into Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of Jean's favorites. His confidence grew as his fingers rediscovered their full dexterity, the years seeming to fall away as he played. This piano responded to his lightest touch, making it easy to shape the music exactly as he heard it in his mind. More guests drifted toward the sound, conversations pausing as people were drawn to the unexpected performance. Harold remained focused on the keys, on the music, barely registering the growing audience. This was why he had fallen in love with the piano as a boy. This feeling of creating something beautiful out of silence, of speaking a language that needed no words. From across the lobby, Diane Wilson, the event coordinator, was in the middle of confirming details with the catering manager when she noticed the crowd gathering around the piano. Frowning slightly, she checked her watch. The hired pianist wasn't due for another 50 minutes. Who was playing? "Excuse me," she said to the catering manager. "I need to check on something." Making her way across the room, Diane's frown deepened as she saw an elderly man she didn't recognize seated at the expensive Steinway. He certainly wasn't the young professional she had hired for the evening. How had this happened? Who had given permission? As she got closer, pushing politely through the small crowd that had formed, Diane had to admit that whoever this man was, he could certainly play. The music was beautiful, performed with a sensitivity that spoke of years of training and practice. But that wasn't the point. This was an organized event with scheduled entertainment. They couldn't just have random people sitting down at the piano. Harold brought the nocturne to its conclusion, his hands lifting gently from the keys. The applause was warmer this time, the audience having grown to maybe 20 people. He looked up, a slight blush coloring his cheeks at the attention. It had been so long since he'd played for others, he'd forgotten the warm connection that formed between performer and listener. As the applause faded, he began to consider what to play next. Perhaps something a bit more lively. Beethoven maybe, or excuse me, sir. Harold looked up to see a woman in her 40s standing beside the piano. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a headset and carried a tablet. Everything about her posture spoke of efficiency and authority. "Yes?" Harold replied, his hand still resting lightly on the keys. "I'm Diane Wilson, the coordinator for this event," she said, her voice professional but firm. "I'm afraid this piano is reserved for our scheduled entertainment this evening." Harold's smile faded slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry. One of your staff members, Robert, I believe, said it would be all right if I played until your musician arrived." Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. Robert again, always making decisions that weren't his to make. "I apologize for the confusion, but Robert isn't authorized to give that permission," she explained. "We have a strict schedule to maintain, and our hired pianist needs time to prepare before his performance." Harold nodded slowly, the joy that had been building inside him deflating like a balloon. "Of course, I understand completely." He began to rise from the bench, his knees protesting slightly after sitting in one position. A few people who had been listening looked disappointed. "That was lovely," said an older woman standing nearby. "Couldn't he play just one more piece?" Others murmured in agreement, but Diane shook her head. "I'm sorry, but we have a program to follow," she said firmly before turning back to Harold with a softer expression. "You play beautifully, sir, but we need to prepare for our scheduled performance." Harold smiled politely, hiding the sting of disappointment. "No need to apologize. Rules are rules, and I shouldn't have sat down without proper permission." As he stood and stepped away from the piano, a young girl tugged at her mother's dress and loudly whispered, "But Mommy, the old man plays better than my piano teacher." Several chuckles followed, and Harold felt his face warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. He made his way through the small crowd, nodding thanks to those who complimented his playing. Finding an empty chair against the wall, Harold sat down, his hands still tingling from their brief reunion with a truly magnificent instrument. He watched as a staff member came to close the piano lid and adjust the bench, preparing for the real musician who would arrive later. A small part of him wished he could have played just one more piece, something that would really showcase what he could do, something that might have made the coordinator reconsider her decision. But he pushed the thought away. This wasn't his night, wasn't his place. Still, as he sat quietly observing the elegant event continue around him, Harold couldn't help but remember how it had felt. Those few minutes at the piano with people gathering to listen, how alive he had felt, how connected to something larger than himself. Little did he know that fate had more in store for him this evening, that his brief moment at the keys was just the beginning of a night that would change everything. Harold sat quietly in his corner chair, watching the charity event unfold around him. The guests had returned to their conversations after his brief performance, though a few people glanced his way with kind smiles or nods of recognition. He didn't mind being asked to stop playing. Rules were rules, after all, and he hadn't been invited as a performer. A young waitress with curly hair stopped beside his chair, offering a tray of appetizers. "Would you care for something to eat, sir?" "Thank you, dear," Harold said, selecting what looked like a small pastry with cheese. As he took it, the waitress leaned slightly closer. "I heard you playing earlier," she said quietly. "It was beautiful." Harold smiled, warmed by the compliment. "That's very kind of you to say. Do you play professionally?" she asked, balancing her tray with practiced ease. "Oh, not for many years," Harold replied. "I taught music at Springfield High for nearly 4 decades, though. Piano was always my first love." The waitress, her name tag read Lucy, looked like she wanted to chat more, but a subtle signal from her supervisor sent her moving along to other guests. Harold watched her go, then turned his attention back to the room at large. The space had grown more crowded as additional guests arrived. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses mingled beneath the chandeliers, their jewelry catching the light. Harold felt increasingly out of place in his old blazer and gray slacks. Perhaps it was time to make his exit. He'd made his small donation, heard some nice conversations, and even played a bit on that magnificent piano. Good evening, all things considered. Just as he was preparing to stand, he noticed a flurry of activity near the entrance. Diane, the event coordinator who had asked him to stop playing, was speaking rapidly into her headset, her expression growing increasingly concerned. She was joined by an older man in a tuxedo, who appeared to be someone important. The hotel manager, perhaps, or the charity director. Their conversation was animated, with Diane gesturing emphatically and checking her watch several times. Harold couldn't hear what they were saying, but years of teaching had made him adept at reading body language. Something had gone wrong. Curious, Harold remained in his seat. The background music, soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, continued as guests chatted, seemingly unaware of any problem. But the staff were another matter. They moved with new urgency, communicating in hushed tones and discreet hand signals. After a few minutes, Diane broke away from her conversation and hurried across the room toward the piano. She spoke briefly with a hotel staff member who nodded and began adjusting the microphone stand positioned nearby. Harold watched with interest as the piano bench was readjusted and sheet music was placed on the stand. It seemed the scheduled entertainment was about to begin, though something about the staff's demeanor suggested things weren't proceeding as planned. Harold glanced at his watch. It was only 7:15 p.m., and he recalled hearing that the pianist wasn't due until 7:30. His curiosity was interrupted when Lucy, the friendly waitress, appeared at his side again. "Excuse me." "Sir," she said, her voice low. "Ms. Wilson asked if you could join her by the piano for a moment." Harold blinked in surprise. "Me?" Lucy nodded. "Yes, sir. She'd like to speak with you." Puzzled but intrigued, Harold rose from his chair, his knees creaking slightly in protest. He followed Lucy through the crowd, several guests stepping aside to let them pass. As they approached the piano, Harold could see Diane's face more clearly now. The composed efficiency he'd observed earlier had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety. "Mr. Matthews," she said when he reached her, surprising him that she remembered his name. "Thank you for coming over." "Not at all," Harold replied. "Is everything all right?" Diane glanced around quickly, then lowered her voice. "We have a situation. Our pianist for the evening, Anthony Reeves, is stuck in traffic on the highway. There was an accident, and he's been sitting without moving for over 40 minutes. He just called to say he might not make it until after 8:30. Harold nodded, beginning to understand why he'd been summoned. That's unfortunate. Yes, it is, Diane agreed, her professional composure slipping just slightly. The chairman of the hospital board is about to give his speech, after which we were supposed to have 30 minutes of piano music while dinner is served. She took a deep breath before continuing. Lucy mentioned that you're a former music teacher who plays quite beautifully. I know I asked you to stop earlier and I apologize for that, but I'm wondering if you might consider helping us out? Harold tried to keep his face neutral, though he could feel a small spark of excitement ignite inside him. You'd like me to fill in for Mr. Reeves? Just for a while, Diane clarified quickly. Just until he arrives. We'd be incredibly grateful, and of course we'd provide you with dinner and acknowledge your contribution to the event. Harold glanced at the piano, then back at Diane's hopeful expression. He thought of Jean, who had always encouraged him to say yes to opportunities that came his way. I'd be happy to help, he said simply. The relief on Diane's face was immediate and profound. Thank you, Mr. Matthews, this is very kind of you. Please call me Harold, he said with a smile. Harold, she repeated, her professional demeanor returning. The chairman will speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we'd like you to play during dinner service. Light classical pieces would be perfect. Does that sound manageable? Certainly, Harold nodded. Any particular requests? Whatever you feel comfortable playing, Diane replied. I trust your judgment. As they spoke, the distinguished-looking man Harold had noticed earlier approached the microphone set up near the piano. The room gradually quieted as he tapped gently on the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, he began in a resonant voice, welcome to the 32nd Annual Children's Hospital Benefit. I'm Dr. Lawrence Chen, chairman of the hospital board. As Dr. Chen continued his speech, thanking donors and explaining the evening's program, Diane quickly briefed Harold on the logistics. You'll start playing as soon as Dr. Chen finishes. The servers will begin bringing out the first course then. Plan for about 30 minutes of music, though if Anthony arrives sooner, we can transition between pieces. Harold nodded, mentally sorting through his repertoire for appropriate selections. He hadn't prepared for a performance, but after decades of teaching and playing, he had plenty of pieces memorized that would suit a dinner service. As Dr. Chen's speech continued, Harold noticed Lucy approaching with a glass of water, which she placed discreetly on the piano. Thought you might need this, she whispered with a supportive smile before disappearing back into the crowd. The simple kindness touched Harold. He smoothed his blazer and straightened his tie, wishing fleetingly that he'd worn his better suit. But it was too late for such concerns now. Dr. Chen's speech was drawing to a close. And so with your generous support, we will be able to complete the new pediatric oncology wing by next spring. Thank you all for coming tonight and opening your hearts and your checkbooks for the children who need us most. Applause filled the room as Dr. Chen stepped away from the microphone. Diane gave Harold an encouraging nod. It was time. With a deep breath, Harold approached the piano bench. He was aware of eyes turning toward him, of the quiet murmurs of guests wondering who this unfamiliar elderly man might be. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. It had been years since he'd played for an audience this size or this prestigious. As he carefully seated himself at the bench, adjusting it slightly, Harold caught sight of an older woman at a nearby table watching him with interest. Something about her reminded him of Jean. Perhaps it was the way she held herself with dignity and quiet grace. He imagined his wife was here with him in spirit, sitting in her favorite spot in their living room, smiling as his fingers found the keys. Harold placed his hands on the keyboard, took another steadying breath, and began to play. He started with Mozart's Piano Sonata in C major, K545, familiar, elegant, perfect for background music during a formal dinner. The Steinway responded beautifully to his touch, its tone rich and resonant in the large space. As the first notes filled the room, Harold felt his nervousness melt away, replaced by the comfortable focus that always came when he immersed himself in music. The servers began moving through the room with trays of salads as Harold played, the timing working out exactly as Diane had planned. Conversations resumed at a more subdued volume, the piano providing a perfect backdrop without overwhelming the social atmosphere. As Harold transitioned smoothly into Beethoven's Für Elise, he allowed himself to look around the room. The guests seemed pleased with the music, some nodding appreciatively in his direction while others simply enjoyed their meal. Diane stood at the edge of the room, visibly relaxed now that this potential crisis had been averted. Harold moved through his mental catalog of pieces, selecting those that would create the perfect atmosphere, not too somber, not too lively. After Beethoven came Chopin's Waltz in B minor, then a Bach prelude. Each piece flowed naturally into the next, creating a tapestry of sound that complemented the elegant event. As he played, Harold felt something awakening inside him, a part of himself that had been dormant since retirement. Teaching had been rewarding, but there was a special joy in performance that couldn't be replicated in a classroom. The connection between performer and audience, the shared experience of music in the moment, he had missed this more than he realized. Halfway through Debussy's Arabesque No. 1, Harold noticed a small group gathering closer to the piano. Unlike his earlier impromptu performance, this time they maintained a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude but clearly drawn to the music. Among them was the woman who reminded him of Jean. Her eyes closed as she swayed slightly to the gentle melody. The main course was being served now, the scent of roasted chicken and vegetables mingling with the perfumes and colognes of the well-dressed guests. Harold had been playing for nearly 20 minutes and his fingers were warming up nicely. Finding their old strength and flexibility, he decided to increase the complexity slightly, moving into Chopin's Nocturne Op. 9, No. 2, still appropriate for dinner music, but with more emotional depth. As the piece developed, Harold allowed himself to put more feeling into his playing. This had always been one of Jean's favorites, and he played it now as if it were just for her. The room seemed to grow quieter, more attentive. Even the servers paused briefly in their duties, the beauty of the music momentarily transcending the practical necessities of the evening. Harold didn't notice Diane checking her watch with growing concern, nor did he see her speaking urgently into her headset. He was lost in the music now, his 75 years falling away as his fingers danced across the keys with the sureness and sensitivity that had once made his teachers predict a concert career. Little did he know that the scheduled pianist was still hopelessly stuck in traffic, or that Diane was now hoping Harold would be willing to play for the entire evening. Little did he know that among the guests were several influential people from the local arts community, including the director of the city's Performing Arts Center, and little did Harold Matthews know that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined when he'd walked through the hotel's revolving doors just a few hours earlier. Harold's fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence as he finished the Chopin Nocturne. The final notes hung in the air for a moment before soft applause rippled through the dining room. He hadn't expected applause during a dinner performance. Background music rarely received such acknowledgement, but he nodded his thanks with a small smile before seamlessly transitioning into Schumann's Träumerei. As he played, Harold noticed Diane speaking urgently into her headset near the entrance to the ballroom. Her expression told him all he needed to know. The scheduled pianist still hadn't arrived. 30 minutes had stretched to 45, and now they were approaching the 1-hour mark of his impromptu performance. Strangely, Harold didn't feel tired. If anything, each piece energized him more than the last. His arthritic fingers, which often troubled him during his morning practices at home, seemed to have forgotten their age. The music flowed through him as if no time had passed since his younger days. Between pieces, Harold took a small sip of water. Lucy appeared at his side with a fresh glass and a folded napkin containing what looked like small sandwiches. "Ms. Wilson thought you might be hungry," she whispered. "You can eat these between songs." "Thank you," Harold replied quietly. "Any news about Mr. Reeves?" Lucy shook her head, still stuck. "The accident is pretty bad from what I heard." She glanced around quickly and added, "Everyone loves your playing, though Dr. Chen said you're the best pianist we've had at these events." Before Harold could respond, Lucy was called away, leaving him with a warm feeling of appreciation. He took a bite of one of the tiny sandwiches, cucumber and cream cheese on soft white bread, before beginning Debussy's Clair de Lune again, this time playing it with more depth and expression than his earlier abbreviated version. The main course was finishing now, and servers were clearing plates in preparation for dessert. Harold noticed that many conversations had quieted, with more guests turning their attention toward the piano. What had begun as background music was gradually becoming something closer to a recital. As the final delicate notes of Clair de Lune faded, the applause was noticeably stronger. Harold looked up to see many guests watching him with genuine appreciation. The woman who reminded him of Jean caught his eye and raised her champagne glass in a small salute. Diane approached the piano, bending slightly to speak near his ear. "Mr. Matthews, Harold, I'm so sorry, but Mr. Reeves just called again. He's finally moving, but he won't be here for at least another 40 minutes. She hesitated. "Would it be too much to ask you to continue? You're playing beautifully and the guests are clearly enjoying it." Harold's heart beat a little faster. He hadn't played for this long in years, but his hands felt strong, his mind clear. "I'd be happy to continue," he said. "But perhaps it's time for something a bit more substantial." Diane looked momentarily puzzled. "Substantial?" Harold smiled. "I've been playing pleasant background music, but I think our audience might appreciate something with a bit more depth now that dinner is winding down." Understanding dawned on Diane's face. "Of course, whatever you feel is appropriate." As she stepped away, Harold took a moment to consider his next piece. He had been holding back, choosing simpler, more familiar work suited for dining. But now, with dessert being served and the formal portion of the evening nearing its end, perhaps it was time to show what he could really do. Harold closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. When he opened them, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The opening notes, gentle yet pregnant with emotion, silenced several nearby conversations immediately. This was no background music. This was a piece that demanded attention, that told a story through its complex emotions and technical challenges. The ballade built slowly, moving from its pensive beginning toward increasingly complex passages that required all the skill Harold had developed over his decades of playing. As the piece progressed, Harold lost himself in the music. His awareness of the room faded, replaced by total focus on the dialogue between his hands and the magnificent Steinway. When the music called for power, his fingers found strength he didn't know he still possessed. In the delicate passages, he played with a feather-light touch that made the notes seem to float in the air. Servers paused in their work. Conversations throughout the room dwindled to whispers, then to silence. Even the clink of silverware against plates grew less frequent, as more and more people turned to watch the elderly man at the piano, his face transformed by concentration and joy. The ballad was demanding, technically, physically, emotionally, but Harold felt equal to its challenges. Years seemed to fall away as his fingers found their way through the complex runs and arpeggios. His left hand provided a solid foundation while his right danced through the intricate melodies. This was why he had fallen in love with the piano as a boy. This feeling of being fully alive, fully present, connecting with something timeless and profound. As he approached the tumultuous final section, Harold's playing grew more passionate. The music surged forward, waves of sound crashing through the room. When he reached the powerful conclusion, his hands struck the final chords with authority and precision. The last notes resonated in the suddenly silent room. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then applause erupted, not the polite acknowledgement of dinner music, but enthusiastic, even awestruck appreciation. Some guests rose to their feet. Harold blinked, coming back to himself, suddenly aware of the room full of people staring at him with expressions ranging from surprise to delight to wonder. Dr. Chen approached the piano, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. "That was extraordinary," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's show our appreciation for Mr. Harold Matthews, who has so generously shared his remarkable talent with us tonight." The applause grew stronger as Harold stood and gave a small, humble bow. His cheeks felt warm. It had been a very long time since he'd received a standing ovation. He wasn't quite sure what to do with himself now. Dr. Chen seemed to sense his uncertainty. "Perhaps you'd join me for a moment," he suggested, gesturing toward the small stage where he'd given his speech earlier. Harold nodded and followed him. His legs felt a bit shaky, the emotional and physical exertion of the ballade catching up with him now that the adrenaline was fading. When they reached the microphone, Dr. Chen addressed the crowd again. "We had planned to have Anthony Reeves perform for us this evening, but as you know, fate sometimes has other ideas. Instead, we've been blessed with the remarkable talent of Mr. Harold Matthews. He turned to Harold. "Would you mind telling us a bit about yourself?" Harold hesitated, then leaned toward the microphone. "There's not much to tell," he said simply. "I taught music at Springfield High School for 38 years before retiring. Piano has been the great joy of my life." "You play like someone who has performed professionally," Dr. Chen remarked. Harold smiled slightly. "There was a time when I hoped to. Life led me down a different path, a good path with wonderful students and a family I loved dearly." He paused, thinking of Jean and Thomas. "But yes, I did study at the conservatory in my youth." A woman near the front called out, "Which conservatory?" "Curtis Institute in Philadelphia," Harold replied. "A long time ago now." A murmur went through the crowd. The Curtis Institute was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, famously selective in its admissions. Dr. Chen looked impressed. "And now you're retired?" Harold nodded. "Yes, though I still play every day at home. My wife Jean always insisted on that. Even on the busiest days, make time for what you love." There was something about Harold's simple sincerity that touched the room. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he was simply sharing a piece of his heart. "Well," Dr. Chen said, "I think I speak for everyone when I say we are tremendously grateful that you came tonight and stepped in when we needed you. Would you be willing to play one more piece for us?" Harold looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Among them, he saw Lucy smiling encouragingly from her position by the wall. Diane stood nearby, her earlier stress replaced by something like wonder. The woman who reminded him of Jean nodded slightly as if to say, "Go on." "I'd be honored," Harold replied. As he returned to the piano, he felt a strange mixture of emotions, joy at playing for an appreciative audience again, a bittersweet awareness of how much he'd missed this, gratitude for this unexpected opportunity. He settled himself on the bench, took a deep breath, and began Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. The piece opened with bold, resonant chords that immediately commanded attention. More technically demanding than anything he'd played so far, it required power and precision in equal measure. Harold's hands moved with authority across the keys, finding the balance between the piece's dramatic intensity and lyrical heart. The room was utterly silent except for the music. Every eye was on Harold, whose posture had straightened, whose movements were now infused with confidence. This wasn't an elderly man filling in during an emergency. This was an artist sharing a lifetime of music, of passion, of dedication to his craft. As he played, Harold felt Jean's presence strongly, as if she were standing beside the piano as she had so many times during their life together. "Play from your heart, Harry," she used to tell him. "That's where the real music lives." And so he did, pouring everything into the Rachmaninoff, his love for music, his gratitude for this unexpected moment, the joys and sorrows of his 75 years. The piece built to its powerful climax, then subsided into the final gentle questioning phrases before the decisive closing chords. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the room erupted in applause even stronger than before. Every guest was on their feet. Harold stood and bowed again, his eyes moist with emotion. As the applause continued, he didn't notice a distinguished-looking man in the back of the room watching him with intense interest, nor did he see this man leaning over to speak with Diane, who nodded eagerly in response to whatever he was saying. Harold didn't know it yet, but his performance tonight was about to open doors he had thought closed forever. The applause finally began to fade as Harold took his third bow. His cheeks were flushed with emotion, his heart beating quickly in his chest. He hadn't experienced this kind of reception well, had he ever? Even in his youth, when he'd performed in student recitals at the conservatory, he'd never received such warm, genuine appreciation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen said, stepping back to the microphone, "I think we can all agree that we've witnessed something quite special tonight. Mr. Matthews, thank you for sharing your extraordinary gift with us." Harold nodded modestly, not trusting himself to speak. His throat felt tight with emotion. "And now," Dr. Chen continued, "as we move into the next portion of our evening, I invite you all to enjoy coffee and dessert. Our silent auction will conclude in 30 minutes, so please make your final bids. Thank you all again for your generosity toward Children's Hospital." As the formal program concluded, guests began to move about the room more freely, visiting the auction tables or refreshing their drinks. Harold remained at the piano, unsure whether he should play more or if his unexpected performance was now over. Before he could decide, he found himself surrounded by a small crowd of well-wishers. "That was absolutely magnificent," said an elderly gentleman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Rachmaninoff is a personal favorite of mine, and I've rarely heard it played with such feeling. The Chopin brought tears to my eyes," added a woman in a midnight blue dress. "My daughter studied piano for years, but I've never heard anyone play with such soul," offered her companion, and several people nodded in agreement. Harold thanked them sincerely, a bit overwhelmed by the attention. He'd grown used to a quiet life since retirement, with days spent reading, tending his small garden, and playing the piano mostly for himself. This sudden spotlight felt both strange and oddly familiar, like returning to a place he'd once known well. The crowd parted slightly as Diane approached, accompanied by a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Harold recognized him as the man who had been watching intently from the back of the room during his performance. "Mr. Matthews," Diane said, her tone now warm with respect rather than the harried efficiency of earlier. "I'd like to introduce Richard Harmon, the director of the Riverside Performing Arts Center." The silver-haired man extended his hand. "Mr. Matthews, it's a pleasure. Your performance was remarkable." Harold shook his hand, noticing the firm grip and direct gaze. "Thank you, sir. That's very kind." "Not kind at all, simply accurate," Richard replied. "I've been directing the Arts Center for 15 years, and I've heard many pianists. Few have your combination of technical skill and emotional depth." He paused, studying Harold's face. "Diane tells me you studied at Curtis." Harold nodded. "Many years ago. I graduated in '72. "Did you pursue a concert career after your studies?" Richard asked. A flicker of old memories, hopes, dreams, and choices made passed through Harold's mind. "No," he said simply. "Life took me in a different direction." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Teaching, I understand. A noble profession." "It was rewarding work," Harold agreed. "Watching young people discover music, helping them find their own voice at the keyboard, there's nothing quite like it." "I can imagine," Richard said. "Still, hearing you play tonight." He hesitated, then spoke more directly. "Mr. Matthews, would you be interested in performing at the Arts Center?" Harold blinked, sure he'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" "We have a series called Hidden Treasures that features exceptional musicians who aren't on the typical concert circuit. Based on what I heard tonight, you would be perfect." Harold felt lightheaded suddenly. "Mr. Harmon, I'm 75 years old. I haven't performed formally in decades," Richard smiled.
"Age is irrelevant when it comes to artistry."
"What matters is what happens when you sit at that piano. And what happens, Mr. Matthews, is magic." Before Harold could respond, he felt a light touch on his arm. It was the woman who reminded him of Jean, her eyes warm with appreciation. "Excuse my interruption," she said in a gentle voice, "but I simply had to tell you how moved I was by your playing. My husband was a pianist. He passed away 5 years ago. And hearing you tonight brought back so many wonderful memories." "Thank you," Harold said, genuinely touched. "I'm sorry about your husband," she smiled. "Don't be. We had 46 wonderful years together, and music was always at the center of our lives." She paused. "He would have loved your interpretation of the ballad. It was his favorite piece." Something about her kindness and the personal connection broke through Harold's overwhelmed state. He smiled at her, then turned back to Richard Harmon. "Mr. Harmon, your offer is unexpected and flattering, but I'm not sure I'm prepared for a formal recital. Tonight was different. I was just filling in. And yet you played pieces most professionals approach with caution. And you did so beautifully," Richard countered. "But I understand your hesitation. Why don't we start with something smaller? We have a lunchtime concert series, 45 minutes, intimate setting, very casual. Would you consider that?" Harold felt torn between excitement and anxiety. The thought of preparing a program, practicing with purpose again, sharing music with an audience. It stirred something deep inside him that he'd thought long dormant. But doubt crept in too. What if tonight had been a fluke? What if his hands, cooperating so well this evening, returned to their usual stiffness tomorrow? As if reading his thoughts, the woman beside him spoke again. "Sometimes the universe gives us unexpected gifts," she said quietly. "The question is whether we have the courage to accept them." It was exactly the sort of thing Jean would have said. Harold looked at her gratefully, then back at Richard Harmon. Perhaps I could consider the lunchtime series. Richard smiled broadly. Excellent. Here's my card. Call me next week and we'll discuss details. He glanced at his watch. I'm afraid I have another engagement, but it was truly a pleasure to meet you. Mr. Matthews, I look forward to our conversation. As Richard and Diane moved away, Harold found himself surrounded again by appreciative guests. He answered their questions politely, accepted their compliments with grace, and gradually began to enjoy the unexpected attention. It had been so long since he'd talked about music with people who truly cared about it. Across the room, he spotted Lucy watching him with a wide smile. She gave him a thumbs-up sign, and he returned a small wave. It was strange to think that just a few hours ago he had been asked to stop playing, and now he was the center of attention. Eventually, the crowd around him thinned as guests returned to the silent auction or prepared to leave. Harold found himself alone at the piano again, Richard Harmon's business card in his pocket, feeling like a ticket to a future he'd long ago stopped imagining for himself. He placed his fingers lightly on the keys, not playing, just feeling their cool smoothness. Should he say yes to Richard's invitation? Could he still perform at his age? What would Jean have said? The answer came immediately, as clearly as if she'd whispered in his ear. Of course you should, Harry. Music has always been your greatest gift. Why wouldn't you share it? Harold smiled to himself. After all these years, he could still hear her voice so clearly. His thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Chen approached, carrying a small plate with a slice of chocolate cake. I noticed you haven't had dessert yet, he said, setting the plate on top of the piano. Chef Michel's chocolate cake is not to be missed. Thank you, Harold replied. And thank you for allowing me to play tonight. It's been quite an evening. Dr. Chen sat down beside him on the bench, surprising Harold slightly. May I speak frankly, Mr. Matthews? Of course. When Diane told me our pianist was stuck in traffic and she'd found a replacement, a retired music teacher, I was concerned, to put it mildly. These events are important for our fundraising efforts, and the quality of everything, including the music, matters to our donors. Dr. Chen looked directly at Harold. I want to apologize for underestimating you so severely. Harold chuckled. No apology necessary. I'm just an old man who loves to play piano. You're considerably more than that, Dr. Chen said seriously. I saw Richard Harmon speaking with you. He rarely attends these events, and he never stays long when he does. The fact that he sought you out speaks volumes. Harold nodded, not sure how to respond. I hope you'll accept whatever opportunity he offered. Dr. Chen continued. Talent like yours deserves to be heard. He stood and extended his hand. The hospital would like to offer you a small honorarium for your performance tonight. That's not necessary, Harold protested. I was happy to help. Nevertheless, we insist. And we'd be honored if you would consider playing at next year's benefit, as our invited guest artist, properly compensated, of course. Harold felt a lump forming in his throat again. I'd be delighted, he managed to say. As Dr. Chen walked away, Harold noticed the room had emptied considerably. The event was winding down, servers clearing the last of the dishes, guests saying their goodbyes. He glanced at his watch, surprised to see it was nearly 10:30. He'd been at the piano for over 3 hours. He should be exhausted, he thought, but strangely he felt energized, more alive than he had in years. Something had awakened in him tonight, something he'd thought was gone forever. The woman who reminded him of Jean approached one last time, pulling on elegant black gloves. I'm leaving now, she said, but I wanted to say goodbye, and to thank you again for the beautiful music. It was my pleasure, Harold replied sincerely, and thank you for your kind words earlier. They meant a great deal, she smiled. Will you take Mr. Harmon up on his offer? Harold touched his pocket where the business card rested. I'm leaning toward yes. Good, she said simply. Music like yours is a gift too precious to keep hidden. She extended her hand. I'm Eleanor, by the way. Harold, he replied, shaking her hand gently. It's been a pleasure meeting you, Eleanor. I attend most of the concerts at Riverside, she said. Perhaps we'll see each other again. As Eleanor walked away, Harold found himself hoping they would indeed meet again. There was something about her grace and kindness that lifted his spirits. He turned back to the piano one last time, letting his fingers rest lightly on the keys. So much had changed in just a few hours. He'd come here tonight as a modest donor, just wanting to make a small contribution to a good cause. Now he was leaving with business cards, invitations, and the rekindling of a dream he'd set aside decades ago. Harold played one final quiet chord, a gentle goodbye to the magnificent Steinway that had been his partner in this unexpected adventure. As the sound faded, he knew something important had changed. For the first time in many years, Harold Matthews was looking forward to tomorrow, and to all the music it might bring. 3 months had passed since the night at the Westmore Hotel. Harold sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he reviewed the program one last time. Today was the day, his first official performance at the Riverside Performing Arts Center. The lunchtime concert series was held in the center's smaller recital hall, with seating for about 100 people. Richard Harmon had assured him it would be a friendly, appreciative audience, mostly regulars who came for their love of music, rather than to critically evaluate the performers. Still, Harold couldn't help the flutter of nerves in his stomach. He ran his fingers over the printed program. His name was right there in clean. Black type, Harold Matthews Piano. Below it, the pieces he'd selected after weeks of careful thought: Bach's Prelude and Fugue in C minor, Mozart's Sonata in F major, 3 Chopin nocturnes, and finally, the piece that had so captivated the audience at the benefit, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The sound of his doorbell pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window, he could see Richard's silver sedan in the driveway. The arts director had insisted on driving Harold to the venue himself to ensure our star performer arrives in style, as he'd put it with a smile. Harold took one last look around his small, tidy house. On the mantel sat a photograph of Jean, taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. "Wish me luck," he whispered to her image before grabbing his coat. Richard greeted him warmly. "Ready for your debut, Harold?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Harold replied with a nervous smile. "Though I'm not sure debut is the right word at my age." "Reinvention, then," Richard suggested as they drove toward downtown. "The music world's most exciting new septuagenarian." Harold chuckled despite his nerves. In the weeks following the benefit, he'd come to appreciate Richard's straightforward enthusiasm and genuine love of music. The arts director had been patient but persistent, giving Harold the time he needed to decide while gently encouraging him forward. "How are the ticket sales?" Harold asked, trying to sound casual. Richard smiled. "We're at capacity. Had to add 20 chairs yesterday." Harold felt his heart rate quicken. 120 people? On a Tuesday afternoon? "Word got around after the benefit," Richard explained. "Dr. Chen is coming, by the way, and he's bringing some hospital board members." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar streets of the town where Harold had lived for over 40 years sliding past the window. So much of his life had been spent here, teaching generations of students at Springfield High, raising Thomas for his too brief life, growing old with Jean, and now at 75, a new chapter was beginning. As they approached downtown, Harold's thoughts drifted back to the weeks following the benefit. He'd called Richard 3 days after the event, his decision made after hours of thinking, playing his home piano, and imagining what Jean would have advised. The arts director had been delighted, immediately suggesting the lunchtime series as a perfect starting point. "We'll begin with a 45-minute program," Richard had said. "Choose pieces you love and feel comfortable with. This isn't about impressing critics, it's about sharing your gift." And so Harold had begun preparing, setting up a practice schedule more rigorous than anything he'd maintained since retirement. 4 hours each day at the piano, working through each piece methodically, building his stamina and refining his interpretations. His fingers had protested at first, arthritic joints stiffening after the second hour, but gradually his hands remembered their old strength and flexibility. 2 weeks into his preparation, a delivery truck had arrived at his house. Harold had opened his door to find 2 men carefully unloading a baby grand piano, a Yamaha, not as luxurious as the Steinway at the hotel, but far superior to his old upright. There must be some mistake, Harold had told the delivery men, but there was no mistake. A card attached to the piano read simply, "Every artist deserves an instrument worthy of their talent. With appreciation, Lawrence Chen and the Children's Hospital Board." Harold had stood in his living room, overwhelmed by the generosity, running his fingers lightly over the gleaming keys of this unexpected gift. He'd called Dr. Chen immediately to thank him, and had been touched by the doctor's sincere response. Your music moved people to give more generously than ever before, Dr. Chen had explained. We exceeded our fundraising goal by nearly 30% that night. This is the least we could do in return. The new piano had transformed Harold's practice sessions, inspiring him to work harder, to reach deeper into the music. And on days when doubt crept in, when he questioned whether he was too old for this new beginning, he would remember the faces in the hotel ballroom, the way the room had fallen silent during the ballad. "We're here," Richard announced, pulling into the parking lot behind the art center. "How are you feeling?" Harold took a deep breath. "Nervous, excited, a bit overwhelmed. All perfectly normal," Richard assured him. "Even the most seasoned performers still get butterflies." He checked his watch. "We have plenty of time. Let's get you settled in the green room, and then you can warm up on the piano." The Riverside Performing Arts Center was a modern building of glass and brick, smaller than Harold had imagined, but well-maintained and welcoming. Richard led him through a side entrance, down a corridor lined with photographs of past performers, and into a comfortable room with a small upright piano, a sofa, and a mirror. "The green room," Richard explained. "Take some time to collect your thoughts. I'll come get you in 20 minutes for your warm-up on stage." Alone in the quiet room, Harold sat at the small piano and played a few scales, feeling the familiar movement center him. His nerves were still there, but beneath them ran a current of excitement. After decades of teaching others to play, of nurturing talents both modest and exceptional, he was about to step onto a stage himself. Harold thought about the journey that had brought him here, not just the night at the Westmore, but all the years before. The young man who had studied at Curtis with dreams of concert halls, the husband and father who had chosen a different path, the teacher who had found joy in sharing his love of music with students, the widower who had kept playing, even when there was no one left to hear. All of those versions of himself had led to this moment. Not a missed opportunity finally grasped, but a new opportunity right on time. A knock at the door preceded Richard's return. "Ready for your warm-up?" Harold nodded and followed him through another corridor and onto the stage of the recital hall. The space was intimate but beautiful, with excellent acoustics and a Steinway grand piano positioned center stage. "Take as much time as you need," Richard said, leaving Harold alone with the instrument. Harold sat at the bench, adjusting its height slightly. He played a few chords, testing the action and responsiveness of the keys. The piano was in perfect condition, its tone rich and resonant in the empty hall. He had just finished playing through a particularly challenging passage of the ballade when he heard the sound of a single person applauding. Looking up, Harold saw Eleanor sitting in the third row, smiling warmly. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I wanted to wish you luck before everyone arrived." Harold smiled, genuinely pleased to see her. In the months since the benefit, they had met several times for coffee, developing a friendship based on their shared love of music and the experience of building a life after loss. "I'm glad you came early," he said. "Any advice for a nervous performer?" Eleanor came closer to the stage. "Just remember why you're playing, not for applause or approval, but because music is a gift meant to be shared." She paused. "Walter, my husband, used to say that a performance isn't about perfection. It's about connection." Harold nodded, appreciating both the wisdom and the fact that Eleanor understood his anxiety. "I'll remember that." "I should let you finish your warm-up," she said. "But I wanted to give you something." She handed him a small package wrapped in simple blue paper. Harold opened it carefully to find a handsome leather-bound notebook. Inside, the first page had an inscription, "For new beginnings." "Oshing, thank you," he said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "You can use it to plan future programs," Eleanor suggested with a smile. "I have a feeling this is just the start." After she left, Harold returned to the piano with a lighter heart. He played through sections of each piece, not full out, but enough to connect with the music and the instrument. By the time Richard returned to tell him the audience was being seated, he felt ready. "The hall is full," Richard reported, his eyes bright with excitement. "And there's a surprise in the back row, a reporter from the Tribune. Word has gotten around about our hidden treasure." Harold might have found this news unsettling earlier, but now he just nodded calmly. "I'd better not keep them waiting then." As Harold waited in the wings, listening to Richard's brief introduction, he thought of all the people who had led him to this moment. Jean, who had always believed in him. his old professors at Curtis, who had given him the technical foundation, his students over the years who had kept his love of teaching alive, and more recently, Diane, Lucy, Dr. Chen, Richard, and Eleanor, all of whom had seen something in him that he'd nearly forgotten was there. "It is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Harold Matthews," Richard was saying. And then there was applause, and Harold was walking onto the stage, the lights warm on his face. He bowed slightly to the audience, a full house, just as Richard had said, and took his place at the piano. For a moment he simply sat there, hands resting lightly on his knees, gathering himself. Then he placed his fingers on the keys and began the Bach prelude. The music flowed from him naturally, years of practice and passion distilled into this moment of sharing. As he played, Harold felt the connection Eleanor had spoken of, not just to the audience, but to the composers, to all the musicians who had played these notes before him, to the great, unbroken chain of human expression that music represented. When he reached the Chopin Ballade, his signature piece now, Harold felt no fear, only joy. His hands moved with confidence and sensitivity across the keys, finding both the power and the delicacy the piece demanded. He was no longer a 75-year-old man making an unlikely debut. He was simply a musician, speaking through his chosen instrument, offering his interpretation of one of the great works of the piano repertoire. As the final notes of the ballade faded into silence, there was that magical moment of collective held breath before the applause began. Enthusiastic, genuine appreciation that brought the audience to their feet. Harold stood and bowed, his heart full. This wasn't the career he had once imagined as a young student, nor was it the quiet retirement he had settled into after Jean's passing. It was something unexpected and perfect, a new chapter that honored all that had come before while opening doors to possibilities he had thought long closed. As he took his final bow, Harold caught sight of Eleanor in the audience, applauding with tears in her eyes. Beside her, though only Harold could see her, stood the spirit of Jean, smiling with pride and love. "Thank you," Harold mouthed to both women, one who had been his past, and one who had helped guide him to this new future. Then he turned and walked off stage, already thinking about what pieces he might include in his next program. After all, at 75 he was just getting started.